I never intended to talk about that flight. In aviation, especially military aviation, you learn early that memory is a liability if you let it expand. You log what matters, discard what doesn't, and you don't revisit anything that can't be filed cleanly. Most insertions end that way. This one didn't. I was the pilot in command of a rotary-wing aircraft assigned to a night insertion tasking. Low visibility, terrain masking, no lights. The order came through the usual channels, nothing unusual in tone or urgency. Coordinates were provided, authentication matched, air corridor cleared. On paper, it was routine. A short hop, insert a small element, lift and disappear before dawn. What I noticed first was the map. We were running digital and paper redundancies, standard practice. The coordinates populated correctly on the flight computer, but when I cross-checked them manually, the location didn't resolve to any recognizable terrain feature. No named grid, no recorded landing zone, just elevation data and a contour shape that looked unfinished. I assumed it was an overlay issue. That happens. Temporary grids get pushed for operations that don't exist long enough to be formalized. I didn't question it over comms. You don't clog a channel with what feels like a technicality. We lifted just after midnight. The aircraft behaved normally. Engine temp steady. No vibration beyond baseline. Crew was quiet in the way crews get quiet when everyone knows the margin for error is thin. The night outside the cockpit, glass was dense, almost absorbent. No moon, minimal ambient light. The kind of darkness where depth perception becomes guesswork. As we approached the insertion corridor, I noticed the navigation cues drifting. Not dramatically, just enough that I had to make constant micro-corrections to keep the aircraft aligned. GPS was nominal. INS agreed. But visually, the terrain didn't match what my instruments were telling me to expect. I remember checking the altimeter twice, then a third time. The ground rose faster than it should have for the indicated airspeed. I eased the collective, compensating instinctively, but the aircraft felt like it was settling into something denser than air. Not resistance, guidance. Like a channel narrowing. "Stand by," I told the crew. My voice sounded normal in my headset. That bothered me more than if it hadn't. The insertion point came into view suddenly, without transition. One moment there was nothing but black terrain. The next, there was a clearing directly beneath us. Perfectly circular. No visible markers, no lights, no thermal contrast you'd expect from disturbed ground or human activity. I hovered longer than planned. The ground didn't behave like ground. Rotor wash kicked up almost no debris. Dust should have been everywhere. Instead, the surface absorbed the downwash as if it were damp, though there was no moisture signature on thermal. I glanced again at the map display. The coordinates were correct. The aircraft insisted we were exactly where we were supposed to be, but there was no reference for the place itself. The insertion team was already moving. They trusted the flight more than the terrain. That's how it works. If the aircraft says you're on target, you're on target. I brought us down slowly, holding the hover until the skids made contact. There was no sensation of touchdown, no bump, no shift in weight, no change in engine load. The aircraft simply stopped descending. For half a second, I thought we were still airborne. Then the load indicator adjusted, just slightly, as if acknowledging something it hadn't measured directly. The crew dismounted quickly, efficient, silent. Their boots made no sound I could register through the airframe. When they cleared the rotor arc, I brought the aircraft back up. The moment we lifted, the clearing vanished. Not gradually, not with distance. It was just gone. replaced by unbroken terrain that did not show any sign of disturbance. No circle, no clearing. Nothing that suggested we had just put an aircraft down there. I circled once. That wasn't part of the plan, but neither was losing visual confirmation of a landing zone that had existed seconds earlier. The map still showed the coordinates. The ground did not. I called it in, carefully. Not alarmed, just factual. LZ not visually reacquired. The response came back immediately, calm and unconcerned. Copy. Proceed as briefed. That was the first moment I realized this wasn't a navigation issue. On egress, the flight path felt shorter than it should have. Fuel burn didn't match distance traveled. The clocks disagreed with each other by less than a minute, but enough that I noticed. I logged it mentally and kept flying. We landed back at base before dawn. Shutdown was normal. Post-flight checks showed nothing out of tolerance. No maintenance flags. No anomalies worth reporting if you didn't already know something was wrong. During debrief, the insertion was described as clean. Successful. Coordinates confirmed. No mention of visibility issues. No questions about the landing zone. When I brought it up casually, the response was immediate and procedural. Temporary grid. Non-persistent LZ. Do not include in after-action narrative. That instruction wasn't written down. I signed the log. I filed the flight. And I stopped asking questions. But even now, years later, I can still see that clearing when I close my eyes. Perfectly shaped. Perfectly placed. A landing zone that existed only long enough for us to use it. And according to every map I've checked since, it was never there at all. After that night, I told myself what every pilot tells himself when something doesn't line up cleanly. You flew, tired, the conditions were marginal, the brain fills gaps when reference points disappear. Night flying does that. It stretches perception. It compresses memory. If you don't anchor yourself to procedure, you start inventing meaning where there isn't any. So I anchored myself to routine. The next morning, I reviewed the flight data on my own time. Not formally. Just enough to reassure myself that the instruments had behaved the way instruments are supposed to behave. The track log showed a clean ingress and egress. Altitude changes were smooth. Hover time at the insertion point was within parameters. Fuel consumption fell inside expected margins, even if it felt wrong in my gut. What the data did not show was a landing. There was a brief flattening of the descent curve, a plateau that suggested we had stopped moving vertically, but it never crossed the threshold that formally registers weight on skids. The system treated it as a prolonged hover. Nothing more. I stared at that segment longer than I needed to. Not because it proved anything, but because it didn't disprove what I remembered feeling. The absence was precise, almost deliberate. Later that day, I pulled the mission packet. The coordinates were still there. Same numbers. Same authorization chain. Same signatures. Everything checked out. What was missing was context. No map overlay. No terrain imagery. Just a numeric solution floating without attachment. I asked our navigator about it. Casual tone. Pilots talk shop all the time. He shrugged and said it was probably a tasking pushed from higher up, something compartmented. We get those sometimes, he said. Use it once. Then it disappears. That should have been the end of it, but it wasn't. Over the next week, I flew 3 more night sorties. Different crews, different mission sets, normal landing zones, normal clearings, normal dust, normal wash, normal tactile confirmation when the aircraft met the ground. Every time, my body reacted before my instruments did. You feel landings through your spine, through your teeth, through subtle shifts in pressure that no gauge can quantify. That was what stayed with me, the contrast. Because on that night insertion, my body never received the signal it had learned to expect. The aircraft stopped descending, but my senses never agreed that we had arrived anywhere physical. A few days later, during a routine briefing, the insertion was referenced indirectly, not by name, not by coordinates, just a passing mention of non-persistent access points. The phrase wasn't explained. No one asked for clarification. I wrote it down anyway, not officially, just in the margins of my notebook. Pilots keep notebooks full of things that don't make it into reports. Wind patterns, radio quirks, terrain notes, things that help you survive the next flight. That phrase didn't belong with the others. The more I thought about it, the more I realized how carefully the night had been framed for us. The lack of urgency, the absence of chatter, the way no one reacted when I reported losing visual contact with the landing zone after lift, as if that outcome had already been accounted for. I started paying attention to language after that. How things were described. What was emphasized. What was quietly bypassed. No one ever said the landing zone had been temporary. They said it was non-persistent. That implies intent. One evening, while reviewing satellite imagery unrelated to our unit, I noticed a familiar contour, a shape in the terrain that mirrored what I remembered seeing beneath us that night. Not identical, just similar enough to catch my eye. I zoomed in. The resolution degraded. The feature dissolved into noise. When I pulled back out, it was gone. I told myself that was coincidence. Pattern recognition is a survival trait in pilots, but it's also a liability. You see alignment where none exists. You connect dots that aren't meant to be connected. But once you've seen something behave incorrectly, you start noticing the rules it refuses to follow. I never brought it up again through official channels. Not because I was ordered not to, but because the responses I'd already received told me enough. This wasn't an error that needed correction. It was a condition that had been anticipated. And anticipation, in my world, usually meant someone had been there before. The unsettling part wasn't that the landing zone hadn't been on any map. It was that it hadn't needed to be. It had existed just long enough for us to touch it, and then it had let us go. I tried to put distance between myself and that flight by doing what pilots do best, flying more. The logic is simple. If something feels wrong, you overwrite it with repetition. Muscle memory drowns out doubt. Familiar airframes, familiar routes, familiar procedures. Eventually, the outlier loses its edge, but that insertion didn't fade. Instead, it began to reframe everything that came after it. About 2 weeks later, I was assigned as standby for a separate night mission. Different unit, different objective. I wasn't scheduled to fly unless something went wrong. That meant I had time to sit in the operations room and listen. You hear things there that don't make it into the formal briefings. Half sentences, assumptions, words chosen carefully because everyone in the room already knows what they're supposed to mean. One of the planners referenced access reliability when discussing landing zones. Not suitability, not security, reliability. The distinction caught my attention immediately. Reliability implies repeatability, or the lack of it. I asked what he meant. He looked at me for a moment longer than necessary, then said, "Some places don't stay put." No one reacted. No clarification followed. The conversation moved on. That was when I realized the flight hadn't been unique. It had been categorized. Later that night, I checked the mission archive for similar taskings, not by coordinates, by descriptors. Anything that referenced temporary corridors, non-standard insertion logic, or abbreviated mapping data. Most of what I found was heavily redacted, But the patterns were there if you knew how to look. Short missions. Minimal ground time. No follow-on use of the same landing zone. No persistent infrastructure. No imagery before or after. And always the same instruction buried somewhere near the end of the packet. Visual confirmation not required beyond initial contact. That line made my stomach tighten. Visual confirmation is everything in aviation. You don't commit an aircraft to a surface you can't see. You don't trust instruments alone when lives are hanging below you, unless you're being told that sight itself isn't the controlling factor. I remembered how the clearing had appeared. Not gradually, but fully formed. As if it had been waiting for alignment rather than approach. And how it had disappeared the moment we lifted, leaving nothing behind that could be reacquired. The more I thought about it, the more it felt less like a place and more like a condition. That idea followed me into the cockpit on my next flight. Routine transport. Daylight this time. Mountains clearly visible. Sun casting sharp shadows that made terrain easy to read. I should have felt grounded again. Instead, I found myself watching for absence. There's a moment in every flight where your eyes stop scanning for obstacles and start scanning for expectations. You know what the world should look like at a given altitude, speed, and angle. Deviations jump out immediately. Halfway through the route, I noticed a valley that didn't quite behave. Nothing dramatic. No sudden appearance or disappearance. Just a sense that the depth cues weren't agreeing with each other. The valley looked farther away than it should have been, like a photograph taken with the wrong lens. I adjusted course slightly. The feeling vanished. I didn't mention it to the crew. That night, I wrote another note in my notebook. Just a single line. Some terrain waits. I didn't know what I meant by it at the time. I only knew it felt accurate. Weeks passed. The insertion team that had been dropped off that night rotated out quietly. No after-action stories. No mention of what they'd found or whether the objective had been worth the risk. Just reassignment orders and a new unit patch. I asked one of them about the landing zone. Not directly. Just whether the ground had been solid. He looked at me puzzled. Felt like ground, he said, then added, "Why wouldn't it?" I let it go. But the way he said it bothered me. Not dismissive. Not defensive. Genuinely confused. As if the question itself didn't map to his memory. That was the first time it occurred to me that the anomaly might not be shared equally. That whatever I had noticed in the aircraft, whatever my body had failed to register during touchdown, might not have translated to those who exited onto the surface itself, which meant the aircraft had been the variable, or the observer. That thought stayed with me longer than I wanted it to. Because if the landing zone didn't exist in a conventional sense, then the only thing making it real had been our arrival. And once we left, there was no reason for it to remain. The flight logs didn't contradict that idea. They simply declined to acknowledge it. I stopped treating the insertion as an isolated incident and started treating it as a reference point. Not something to explain, but something to measure against. Once you do that, patterns don't announce themselves. They accumulate quietly. I noticed it in how certain missions were staffed. Flights that involved non-persistent access points were almost always assigned crews with higher night hours, but fewer recent sorties. Pilots who trusted instruments, but hadn't grown complacent with visual shortcuts. People less likely to argue with what the aircraft told them. I was one of those pilots. No one said that out loud, but the assignments spoke for themselves. The briefings for those flights were always shorter. No unnecessary detail. No contingency discussion beyond fuel state and abort criteria. The assumption was that if you questioned the environment too closely, you might disrupt whatever alignment made the tasking possible in the first place. On one of those nights, I asked a ground controller how long the landing zone would be usable. He didn't give me a time, he gave me a condition. "Until you're done with it," he said. That answer stayed with me longer than it should have. In aviation, time governs everything. Fuel, weather, crew fatigue, airspace. Conditions are secondary. You don't usually plan around them because they don't respect schedules. Yet here we were, doing exactly that. The next insertion didn't result in a visible anomaly, but the absence of one felt just as deliberate. The coordinates resolved cleanly. The terrain behaved. Dust kicked up. Weight on skids registered normally. A textbook landing. And yet, when I checked the map afterward, the location still didn't exist beyond that single use. No record. No persistent reference. It was as if the system had generated a solution only because it had been asked to. That's when I realized the map wasn't wrong. It was obedient. It produced what was required and discarded it immediately afterward. I began to understand why no one wanted these details in reports. Writing something down gives it weight. Weight implies persistence. Persistence invites scrutiny. Whatever governed those landing zones didn't want to be scrutinized. During a maintenance delay one afternoon, I found myself talking with a senior crew chief who had been flying longer than I had. He mentioned a mission years earlier where a helicopter had settled onto a ridge that wasn't there on approach and wasn't there on departure. He laughed when he told it. "Must have been the light," he said. But he didn't look amused. I asked him if he'd ever seen it again. He shook his head. "You never see the same place twice," he said. "Not the ones like that." I didn't ask him what he meant by "like that." By then, I already knew. Those landing zones weren't locations in the usual sense. They were intersections. Moments where aircraft, crew, coordinates, and intent overlapped just long enough to permit access. Once that overlap ended, the place dissolved back into whatever passed for normal terrain. That explained the silence surrounding them. No folklore. No call signs. No nicknames. Pilots name everything they fear or respect. These places remained unnamed because naming them would suggest they could be returned to. They couldn't. I started to suspect that the reason I remembered the first one so clearly was because I'd noticed the lack of physical confirmation. The aircraft had never told my body we were truly on the ground. The system had completed the task without completing the sensation. That gap mattered. It marked the difference between touching something and passing through it. And once you notice that difference, it becomes impossible to unnotice. The unsettling part wasn't that the landing zones weren't on any map. It was that they didn't need to be. They existed only in the narrow window between approach and departure, between intent and completion. And as pilots, we were trusted to cross that window without asking what held it open. By the time I accepted that those landing zones weren't places in the way I'd been trained to understand places, I stopped trying to reconcile them with aviation doctrine. Doctrine is built around repeatability. What we were doing depended on the opposite. The next mission that put me near one of those coordinates came months later. I wasn't the primary pilot this time. I was riding right seat, there to observe and backstop. That distance should have made it easier to detach. It didn't. The approach was uneventful, terrain familiar, weather cooperative, instruments clean. If I hadn't known the tasking, I would have assumed we were headed toward an ordinary ridgeline insertion. The flight lead called out checkpoints. I confirmed them. Everything aligned. Then, without warning, the ground solution changed. Not the terrain itself, but the way the aircraft related to it. The descent rate stabilized earlier than expected. The horizon flattened in a way that didn't correspond to our attitude. It was subtle, the kind of thing you only notice when you've spent enough time flying to know when your senses should disagree with your instruments. The pilot flying didn't react. He had no reason to. His displays told him exactly what he needed to know. I watched the altimeter count down. I watched the radar altimeter agree. I waited for the moment where the aircraft would tell us we were done descending. It never came. Instead, the descent stopped because the pilot stopped it. He held us steady, hovering just above a surface neither of us could clearly define. The ground team dismounted. Their movements were efficient, practiced, unremarkable. I asked the pilot afterward whether the landing felt normal. He nodded. Felt solid, he said. Why? I didn't press him, but I watched his hands as he spoke. He wasn't lying. His experience of the event had been complete. The aircraft had given him all the cues it usually does. Mine hadn't. That difference stayed with me through shutdown and into debrief. Once again, the mission was recorded as clean, successful. No anomalies worth noting. I didn't argue. At some point, I realized the discrepancy wasn't about perception. It was about role. The pilot flying had been focused on execution. I had been focused on confirmation. The system rewarded one and withheld from the other. Whatever governed those zones seemed to know the difference. After that, I paid attention to who noticed and who didn't. Crew chiefs rarely commented. Ground teams never did. The pilots who questioned things quietly stopped getting those taskings. Not punished, just reassigned. The ones who accepted the flights as presented continued. I learned to keep my observations internal. Not because I was afraid of consequences, but because I understood something else by then. These operations depended on trust. Not trust between people, but trust in process. Doubt introduced friction. Friction shortened the window. One evening, long after the aircraft was parked and the crews dispersed, I stood alone on the flight line and looked out over terrain I could now recognize even in darkness. It all looked stable, solid, predictable, and yet I knew, with absolute certainty, that somewhere within that landscape were points that could briefly become something else if called upon. Not because they were special, but because they were useful. The thought unsettled me more than any sense of threat ever had. Threats have shape. They can be avoided or confronted. Utility is quieter. It doesn't announce itself. It simply waits. That night, I added one final note to my notebook. Access precedes location. I closed the book and didn't open it again for a long time. I didn't fly another insertion like that for almost a year. Not because they stopped happening, but because I stopped being included. The reassignment was subtle. No paperwork I could point to. Just a shift in availability, different rotations, different taskings. Nothing anyone could complain about without sounding paranoid. At first, I thought it was coincidence. Then I realized it wasn't removal. It was insulation. I was still flying, still logging hours, still trusted with aircraft and crews. But the missions that involved those ambiguous coordinates no longer crossed my schedule. I would hear about them only in passing, referenced obliquely during briefings or in post-mission summaries, stripped of any detail that might invite questions. That should have been a relief. Instead, it felt like being cut off from something I was already halfway inside. I noticed the absence most clearly in my body. The tension I'd grown accustomed to during night approaches faded. My hands stopped anticipating resistance that never came. My eyes stopped searching for terrain that behaved incorrectly. Normal flying resumed its familiar rhythm, but memory doesn't recalibrate as easily as muscle. I began to realize that whatever those landing zones were, they left no trace for those who didn't return to them. No lingering anomalies, no physical residue. Just the knowledge that the rules had flexed once and could do so again. That knowledge became its own weight. During a long-range transport flight, I found myself thinking back to the first night, the way the clearing had appeared whole, the way it had vanished without transition. the lack of sensory confirmation at touchdown. Those details had stayed crisp, untouched by time or reinterpretation. That's not how memory usually works. Most experiences erode at the edges. Details blur. Sensations get overwritten. But that landing zone remained intact in my mind, like a reference image that refused to degrade. It occurred to me then that I hadn't been remembering a place. I had been remembering an event boundary. The moment where expectation and reality stopped agreeing. That boundary didn't belong to geography. It belonged to procedure. It existed because a flight plan had demanded it. I wondered how many other pilots had brushed up against the same boundary without noticing. How many had accepted the cues given to them and moved on without friction? How many had never felt the absence of contact because their role hadn't required them to? That thought led me somewhere uncomfortable. If the system could present a landing zone to some and not others, if it could complete the task without fully committing to physicality, then what we called ground was negotiable under the right conditions. And aviation of all disciplines relies on ground being absolute. I brought none of this up. Not to peers, not to leadership. Not because I'd been told not to, but because I understood by then that explanation wasn't the point. These operations weren't mistakes to be corrected. They were solutions that worked precisely because they avoided definition. You don't fix something that's performing as designed. The more I thought about it, the more I realized the system didn't need pilots to understand what they were interacting with. It only needed them to execute cleanly within a narrow window. Once the window closed, comprehension became irrelevant. That was the quiet brilliance of it. No secrecy required. No enforcement necessary. Just compartmentalization by experience. Those who noticed did so alone. Those who didn't never felt the lack. I began to suspect that was intentional, because shared anomalies become problems. Isolated ones disappear on their own. By the time I rotated out of that unit, the flight had taken on a different quality in my memory. Not as an unresolved mystery, but as a lesson. A demonstration of how easily reality could be shaped to fit operational need, provided no one insisted on naming the shape. The landing zone hadn't been on any map, but it had been exactly where it needed to be. And once its purpose was fulfilled, it had withdrawn without argument. That, more than anything else, convinced me it wasn't an accident. Time did what time usually does. It dulled the urgency without erasing the shape of what had happened. I left that unit, moved on to other assignments, other airframes, other places where the ground behaved the way ground was supposed to behave. On the surface, my career continued uninterrupted. Promotions followed schedule. Evaluations stayed clean. No remarks, no flags. But something had shifted in how I listened. I stopped hearing missions as sequences of actions and started hearing them as conditions. Not what we were doing, but what had to be true for the doing to be possible. Most of the time, those conditions were obvious. Weather windows, enemy posture, airspace clearance. Occasionally, though, I would catch a briefing phrase that didn't belong to any of those categories. Temporal flexibility, access window, environmental compliance. They were never defined. They didn't need to be. Everyone in the room treated them as settled concepts, the way you treat something you've been told not to interrogate too closely. The first time I heard access window again, it wasn't even in a flying context. It was during a joint planning session involving logistics and signal support. No aircraft mentioned. No landing zones, just timing, coordination, and a quiet emphasis on not being early. Too early collapses the solution, someone said. No one laughed. I sat there, silent, feeling the same compression I'd felt on approach to that clearing years earlier. The sense that something was narrowing, aligning, waiting for the right moment to become usable. After the meeting, I checked the map associated with the operation. Everything was normal. Roads, buildings, power infrastructure. No missing pieces, no gaps. And yet the language suggested a fragility I recognized immediately. The world, apparently, only behaved if approached correctly. I began to wonder how often pilots like me had been used as boundary testers without realizing it. Not to explore the unknown, but to verify that it still behaved, that the access points still opened when asked, that they closed cleanly afterward. That realization reframed the way I thought about the risk we'd taken. The danger hadn't been that the landing zone would fail to appear. The danger had been that it might persist, because persistence invites curiosity, and curiosity invites interference. Whatever these access points were, they depended on being transient, useful once, then gone. I thought back to the clearing's perfect geometry, the way it hadn't blended with the surrounding terrain, but hadn't violated it either. It hadn't torn a hole in reality. It had folded into it, briefly, then unfolded again. That wasn't improvisation. That was engineering. Years later, long after I'd stopped flying operational missions, I ran into another pilot from that period. We hadn't flown together, but we shared enough overlap to speak freely. Over drinks, the conversation drifted to strange flights, odd briefings, the usual post-career sorting of memory. I mentioned night insertions. He nodded. Some of them felt thin, he said. I didn't prompt him. I didn't elaborate. I waited. Like the place you landed didn't really want to be there, he added. Or maybe didn't expect you to stay. That was as close as anyone else ever came to describing it the way I would have. We didn't go further. That was the unspoken agreement. You could acknowledge the boundary. You couldn't step over it together. By then, I understood why. Shared understanding would imply shared responsibility. And whatever system governed those access points didn't want witnesses coordinating their memories. It wanted them isolated, self-doubting, functional, effective. I finished my drink and changed the subject. That night, lying awake, I thought again about the moment of liftoff, when the clearing vanished. Not receded, not obscured, simply replaced by terrain that had always been there. The world had corrected itself instantly. That correction had been the most revealing part of the entire experience, because it meant the anomaly wasn't the appearance of the landing zone. The anomaly was us being allowed to see it at all. By the time I understood what that meant, I was far enough removed from active operations that the realization carried no practical consequence. I wasn't flying those missions anymore. I wasn't sitting in briefings where language mattered more than substance. Whatever system had made use of that landing zone no longer required my participation. That distance made the pattern clearer. I started noticing how often alignment was treated as a prerequisite rather than an outcome. Not just in military contexts, but in civilian ones as well. Infrastructure projects delayed without explanation. Exercises postponed until conditions stabilized, even when weather, funding and staffing were all nominal. Decisions framed not around readiness, but around timing that felt intuitive rather than justified. It reminded me of hovering over that clearing, waiting for the aircraft to tell me we were down, even though nothing in my body agreed. Once you felt that disconnect, you recognize it everywhere. I pulled my old flight notebook out of storage one evening. I hadn't opened it in years. The pages smelled faintly of fuel and dust. Most of the entries were ordinary. Headings, wind notes, radio quirks. But the few lines I'd written around that period stood out immediately. They were spare, almost cautious. As if I'd been afraid that writing too much might solidify something better left fluid. Non-persistent LZ. Access precedes location. Visual confirmation not required. Seeing them together stripped away the last of my doubt. Those weren't observations. They were rules. Rules don't emerge spontaneously. They're discovered, refined, and then taught quietly to those who need to use them. That meant someone, somewhere, had already mapped the behavior I'd stumbled into. I hadn't found the edge of something new. I'd brushed against the edge of something old and operational. That reframed the memory of the briefing response when I'd reported losing visual contact with the landing zone. The calm acknowledgement hadn't been dismissal. It had been confirmation. The system had behaved exactly as expected. The unsettling part was how little adjustment it required from the people involved. No special training, no warnings, just trust in procedure and a willingness not to interrogate results too deeply. I began to suspect that most pilots who encountered these zones never noticed anything unusual because the aircraft resolved the experience for them. Instruments agreed, weight indicators adjusted, crew cues aligned. Only when those cues failed to converge, only when someone noticed the absence of confirmation, did the anomaly surface. And even then, it surfaced privately. I thought again about the ground team from that first insertion, how they'd stepped out without hesitation, how their boots had made no sound I could register through the airframe. I wondered whether they remembered anything odd about that night at all, or whether the experience had folded itself neatly into their memory as just another landing. If that was the case, then the system wasn't just managing space, it was managing experience. That idea followed me longer than any fear ever had. Fear fades when nothing happens. This didn't fade. It nested. It became context. Years later, I was asked during a routine security renewal whether I'd ever experienced discrepancies between instrumentation and perception that couldn't be resolved through training or fatigue. The question was framed clinically, almost academically. I answered no, not because it wasn't true, but because I understood the purpose of the question. It wasn't there to elicit information. It was there to identify people who were still thinking about things they shouldn't need to think about anymore. I wasn't interested in being flagged as unresolved. The truth was, I didn't need resolution. I already had it. The landing zone hadn't been a mistake. It hadn't been a glitch. It had been a function. And once I accepted that, the rest of the memory settled into place with uncomfortable clarity. The clarity didn't bring relief. It brought a kind of resignation that was harder to explain to myself than fear ever would have been. Fear implies a choice: fight, flee, avoid. This was different. It was the understanding that what I had encountered didn't require my consent to operate. It had used me briefly, efficiently, and then moved on. I thought about that often in the years that followed. Usually when I was somewhere ordinary, a grocery store, a parking garage, an empty stretch of road at night, places where nothing is supposed to happen. That's where the memory surfaced most clearly, because those were the kinds of environments the landing zone had imitated. Unremarkable, compliant, forgettable. I began to notice how easily space could be taken for granted. We assume permanence because permanence makes planning possible. But that night had shown me that permanence was optional, conditional on need. The clearing had not existed until it was required, and it had ceased to exist the moment it wasn't. That suggested something unsettling. Location itself could be provisional. Not everywhere, not always, only where the cost of permanence outweighed the benefit. I stopped trying to imagine who controlled that calculus. Control implies intention, and intention implies accountability. Whatever governed those access points didn't feel accountable in any human sense. It behaved more like an infrastructure layer than a decision maker, something that optimized outcomes without caring how they were perceived. That was why no one ever talked about it directly. There was nothing to accuse. I occasionally wondered what would have happened if I'd refused to land that night. If I'd called an abort, cited uncertainty, demanded visual confirmation that never came. Would the clearing have persisted longer? Would it have solidified under scrutiny? Or would it have collapsed entirely? The thought never led anywhere useful. Pilots don't rewrite flights after the fact. You fly what you're given, or you don't fly at all. And I had flown it. I thought again about the moment of liftoff, when the aircraft rose cleanly and the ground failed to follow. The absence of turbulence, the lack of resistance. It was as if we had been released rather than departed. That language mattered. Release implies custody. I stopped reading reports about anomalous events after that. Not because I doubted them, but because they misunderstood the nature of what they were describing. They framed things as intrusions, violations, breaches. What I'd experienced felt none of those things. It felt permitted, and permission, once granted, doesn't require explanation. The final time I saw anything that reminded me of that landing zone was entirely mundane. A construction site rerouted traffic through a temporary access road that didn't exist on any map app for weeks. It appeared overnight. It disappeared just as quietly. No one questioned it. It had served its purpose. I sat in my car, waiting for the light to change, and felt a flicker of the same recognition I'd felt in the cockpit years earlier. Access precedes location. That phrase returned unbidden, as intact as the night I'd written it down. Not as a warning, not as a revelation, just as a description of how things worked. The landing zone hadn't been on any map because maps describe what persists. What I had encountered didn't need to persist. It only needed to function. And it had. I've replayed that night often enough to know where memory ends and interpretation begins. The facts remain clean and limited. I was assigned a flight. I was given coordinates that resolved only when I was already committed. I landed in a place that behaved like terrain without possessing the qualities of one. I departed without resistance. The location did not remain. Everything beyond that is inference. But inference is unavoidable when the system offers no official language for what occurred. I never filed a formal anomaly report. There was no category that fit. The closest options implied equipment failure or human error, and neither applied. The aircraft functioned perfectly. The crew performed as trained. The insertion completed without deviation. From an operational standpoint, it was a success. That was the problem. Success implied validation. In the years since, I've come to understand that some operations are designed not to achieve objectives, but to confirm tolerances, to test whether something still works as intended, whether access can be granted without friction, whether observation alters behavior, whether a system remains stable under brief exposure. That night felt like one of those tests. Not of me, of the environment. The landing zone didn't resist because resistance wasn't part of its function. It wasn't a mistake or a breach. It was an interface, briefly instantiated, then withdrawn once its role was complete. If that's true, then the most important detail wasn't that it vanished. It was that it existed long enough to be used. I've been asked, indirectly, whether I'd fly a similar mission again. The question was framed casually, almost rhetorically. Hypothetical. No pressure. I answered honestly, yes, not because I want to, and not because I'm curious, because the absence of a map doesn't imply the absence of structure. It only means the structure isn't meant to be navigated the usual way. I no longer think of that night as an anomaly. I think of it as an early indication, a glimpse of how operations will be conducted when geography becomes optional and access is negotiated at a different layer entirely. No lights, no markers, no permanence, just clearance. If that future arrives quietly, and I believe it will, most people will never notice the transition. They'll move through spaces that appear ordinary, unaware that some of them are provisional. Temporary solutions to problems they'll never be told existed. I happen to be present at one of the early versions. That's all this account is meant to establish. Not that something impossible occurred, only that something functional did. And that, at least once, I was cleared to land where nothing was supposed to be. This is my testimony, not as proof, but as record, because records are how systems remember, even when maps do not.